Hello everyone, welcome back to our ITT mentoring skills development sessions. This is number 3. Next up, we'll be considering a key skill for mentors, and that's that of target setting. We will all have experienced being set targets ourselves, and certainly will have a view as to whether they've been effective or not. Today, we'll get under the skin of target setting and how we can break down the path to success for our trainees. I'm Jenny Fogarty, Director of ITT, and this is the next skills development session. So let's start by clarifying what is a target. This isn't a trick question. You know what a target is. It's really clear that it's about a goal, an outcome, or a direction. That's for our trainees, but that's also for ourselves. It's for any aspect of teaching and learning. A target also for our pupils, links to goals, aspirations, outcomes, next steps, the direction of travel, where we're trying to get someone to go to. In order to secure progress, the steps needed need to be clearly articulated, and that in itself is the target. So a target in our context is how we break down the goal to make something happen. So in order to secure progress, we're articulating the steps needed to make something happen. And if we go back to our first principles of learning theory and think about the zone of proximal development, targets are a concrete example of scaffolding for a trainee. So the steps we have to put in as mentors and teach trainers, thinking about where trainees are and where we want them to get to. That's the zone of proximal development that you'll be familiar with. Targets themselves are the bit in the middle. They're the bit that help us get from one step to the next. So we're going to unpack that a little bit more. But you know what a target is. It's a goal, an outcome, or a direction. Now, in the current landscape for teacher education, often we're renaming the same thing into handy, snappy words, but it's important to go back to first principles, the difference between SMART targets, sharp targets, granular targets. What is it that we're actually talking about here? What makes an effective target, and how do we know? You'll have your own views on this, and you might want to pause the video here to think about what these might be. I'm going to suggest to you that the first and most important thing about any targets that we're setting as mentors is that they're clear, they're specific, they're granular. We know exactly what the target is, where we're trying to get to. On that, they're outcomes driven. So they're thinking about what the next outcome will be. They're goal oriented, and it's very clear that we can link outcomes to the learn how to statements of the ITT ECF. They're action focused. They require trainees to actually do something different. We can measure them, we can celebrate progress along the way, and that there is an on the way. It's an ongoing process. You might have other principles. How do they compare to these? There's a whole literature base around setting targets, and I wanted to draw your attention to the work of Ordonez and al., who are thinking critically about goals. They write extensively about being over-prescriptive, where there might be too many managerial approaches to goal setting. And some of the pitfalls are outlined here. Could you think of an example about where this might apply in your context? Have you ever been told to just keep doing what you're doing and being given that as a goal or a target? How did you feel? Were you frustrated? Maybe you didn't have a mentor who could break down and articulate next steps for you. We need to think about what this might look like in a context with trainees. If we pick one whole learn how to statement from the ITT ECF and set that as a goal, that's not specific, it's not granular, it's not breaking learning steps down, and it could risk some of these behaviours. So how might we guard against this? So we've thought about the principles of effective target setting, and I've asked you to think critically about targets themselves. So now let's have a look at these and consider what makes them less effective or not effective. To improve behaviour management techniques, to raise attainment for PPG children in reading, to plan next week's lessons. Go back to what the principles of effective targets look like, but also thinking about stretch and challenge. Some of these are just too easy. To plan next week's lessons, That's not a target, that's a job. To improve behaviour management techniques, that's far too broad. In what context, with which group of students, over how long? What does improvement look like? And again, to raise attainment for PPG children in reading, that's completely unrealistic for a trainee. So what might that look like? You could take each of these examples and break them down into more positive ones. And the way that you'll do that is by focusing on the language, and that's what we're going to do next. When constructing your targets, I'd really encourage you to think about your use of imperative verbs. Being really clear with language is going to unlock effective target setting. So thinking about how we plan, establish, create, use, model, demonstrate, initiate, write, explain, clarify, generate. Those are clear imperative verbs with a call to action. Whereas to show, to understand, can be seen as more woolly or less clear in ways that are unhelpful to our trainees. You'll have your own verbs that you often use. Check back. Are they strong enough? Do they give a call to action in the way that you want to see? And alongside that, how are you using adjectives and adverbs to enhance those imperative verbs and to give even more clarity to trainees? Independently, confidently, effectively, using own initiative, with support, with greater accuracy. You'll have many more, I'm sure, but increasing granularity and specificity links to language. It's that push for clarity that we're trying to get to. So we're back with the infographic that I'm going to talk you through now, which is a helpful aid memoir when we're thinking about setting targets. But I did also want to draw your attention to Brueggemann's quote below: recall your why. Have your mentee think about a moment or experience that supported their passion for working with students. Discuss that together. There'll be different points during feedback opportunities, offering support, all of the other skills that we're developing. But bearing this in mind as you go along is going to be really helpful, and I would encourage you to just pay attention to that intention. How often do we get trainees to talk about what it is that they are doing this for, what the reason is, their why? And if you're interested in understanding more about motivation and your why, I would encourage you to read the work or listen to some of the podcasts by Simon Sinek. Okay, let's think about phase one, identifying the goal. So again, like all of the infographics I'm sharing with you, we're taking the time to really be specific. We're setting the scene and identifying the goal is breaking down exactly what needs to improve in non-specialist language. So using normal words, nothing too technical, nothing too integrated with the ITT ECF that the trainees might not be ready for. Tell them what it is you want to see an improvement on. Now, as trainees progress through their training, they're much more likely to be able to identify this for themselves, particularly if it is part of a longer piece of work, it's the clear next step. But we've also got to be realistic and recognise that on a 3-year undergraduate programme, trainees are going to be at all parts of the journey in their confidence and competence to identify their own goals. That's where you have to step in as a mentor. That's your job. Don't forget to use the frameworks. We've got the learn how to statements to help us in the ITT ECF. So go back to those documents if you're not sure. Okay, number 2, we're going to move into phase 2 where we're articulating the actions. So we've identified the goal. Now we're articulating the actions because we're going to join those things together. So think about how we're using those imperative verbs to break down the steps needed to move towards the goal. So are these steps that involve a change in knowledge? Do we need to increase subject knowledge in a particular area? Is it about behaviours, either our behaviours or the behaviours we want to see in the pupils that the trainee is working with? Is it something to do with values? Is it something about how trainees are presenting? Is it about resources? Do they need more access or more support? And is there something to do with timing there? So these are all different things that you might want to consider when you're articulating the actions that trainees need to make in order to work towards that goal. And then the final phase, phase 3, is where we clarify success. So we're thinking about what does success look like in this context for this trainee, and how will we celebrate and recognise that? but also thinking about what will it feel like? How will it feel different to the trainee once they've met this goal or reached this target? Don't forget to stop and celebrate. Don't forget to recall your why. We're not just on this constant treadmill of unattainable goals. If trainees don't reach their goals or can't work towards the targets that you're setting, we need to think about that and reframe them, because it's incredibly demoralizing. But if you can break down setting targets into these 3 discrete phases, it's going to go a long way to helping your trainees understand the path to success that they're on. The questions that I get asked a lot: do targets have to be written down? Not always, but pretty much always, yes, they do. There may be examples of verbal targets that you're agreeing, but I would ask you to consider whether those are actually targets. So I think best practice, we would say yes, they do have to be written down. Do targets have to be generated by the trainee? Well, we touched on this briefly in the last slide, but I think it depends at the stage in which the trainee is on. It's really hard for them to understand what they don't know, so the kind of unknown unknowns, and we're helping them to move towards the known unknown space. Do they all have to have the same time limit? Absolutely not, and it would be quite hard to measure if they did all have the same endpoint. You want some short-term targets, some long-term targets. They'll look different if they're on a focused placement, if we're thinking about intensive training and practice, if we're at the end of a transition point for trainees, so whether they're moving into their ECT year or whether they're moving between year 1 and year 2. They're going to look different, so we need to think about how that impacts on the time limits. And then, is the mentor writing the target? It's a key job, so I would say yes. Whether the target's then being fed back to the university in some form, and that's done by the trainee, absolutely. But articulating the target and breaking down that steps is a job for the mentor. But of course that can be negotiated, and as trainees get more confident, they might be happy to do the writing around the target, but you definitely need to sign it off and show your agreement and where your input has been. Here's some key reading for you on this topic, and have a think about how much you are reading around these key skills development areas. That's been a whistle-stop tour through setting targets. It will be an ongoing skill that we develop and refine and review throughout your mentor training, whether that's in negotiation with your lead mentor or you yourself as a school mentor. But we need to think about what it's going to look like and how it's going to benefit our trainees. I look forward to seeing you for the next one. Bye.